Broadly, we can look at K-12 schooling through two different lenses. The first is the difference between schools' goals for the individual student and for the collective students. At various times throughout educational policymaking, schools have focused on one more than the other. Through another lens, however, we can examine schools' intended outcomes or goals. On one hand, schooling might have an impact on society. By this, I mean to suggest that schooling can support the development of democracy as both a political and social phenomenon. Schooling can also have an economic outcome as well. By this, I mean that schools can support students' search for employment. Through a mixture of these lenses, we can better explore the various broad purposes of education, despite the fact that it's not a constitutional right in the United States. One purpose of education is toward the individual good of society. So our first quadrant here. After the American Revolution, there is some concern among politicians and educators that the newly formed union couldn't be maintained because of a lack of enemy and fragmentation in the United States. So here we're talking about a time period between the late 18th century, pretty much through the mid-19th century. So from independence to about the Civil War. In fact, Noah Webster is one of the probably best quoted people around this time period. He said, "Every child in America should be acquainted with his own country. As soon as he opens his lips, he should rehearse the history of his own country. He should lisp the praise of liberty and of those illustrious heroes and statesmen who have wrought a revolution in her favor." So here, Noah Webster expresses the goal to have individual students know the glory of the Union, even if it's fictitious, kind of like Weems' story of Washington and the apple tree. Through this individual knowledge of what it means to be a good citizen, students might be less likely to rebel. So some terms that we might use for this period were good citizen, but it was really a good citizen through a moral component, doing moral good or moral character. A little bit later, so we're talking mid-19th century through the early 20th, so kind of after the Civil War into the beginning of the 1900s, Horace Mann began taking on a different conception. He took on more of a collective social good. And this idea of the good citizen is actually for the betterment of society. He wrote, "To what extent can the resources and powers of nature be converted into human welfare, the peaceful arts of life be advanced, and the vast treasures of human talent and genius be developed? How much of suffering in all its forms can be relieved? Or, what is better than relief, how much can be prevented?" And he wrote that in 1837. Here, Mann expresses that education should be for the benefit of the community, reducing suffering and preventing social ills. It was actually around the turn of the century, a little bit into the early 20th century, that we see this leap from society being a primary purpose of education to economic goals. And that leap actually was in the form of the progressives. This is not to say that all progressives made this leap. In fact, John Dewey was probably one of the best well-known progressives hanging out in this collective society realm. But over here, from the early 20th century, and really we're going to see echoes of this idea today. William Bagley becomes the social efficiency expert here. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. Bagley, among others, was interested in how schooling could be efficient in an effort to maximize the learning of students and reduce the cost of schooling. He actually drew on business models, and using the language of business, these social efficiency scholars trained generations of administrators and teachers, focusing on classroom management activities and specific learning outcomes. And how we see this today is in some of the same manufacturing tools being brought into the schools. For example, the Baldrige or the Six Sigma management styles of helping students and teachers really use time efficiently within the classroom, and thinking of education as an automatic or systematic process that'll lead toward jobs and measured understanding. Interestingly, the individual in the economy didn't come about until probably the mid-20th century, and again, we can see echoes of this today, but it came from a really surprising place, or an example of it comes from a surprising place. Brown versus the Board of Ed, that decision actually provides a judicial example of the implications of the economic lens of the purpose of education in a really individual sense. So in the ruling that separate is not equal, justices asserted that schooling has an economic outcome. Poor education inhibits individual students' abilities to access quote-unquote opportunity. And by that we can kind of read it, this idea of employment. While this landmark case rightly ended segregation within the schools, and there's no doubt about that, it also points to one of the purposes of education, which is future marketability and employment. Now, I want to make a very large disclaimer here in that within this whole framework, I've set up a completely false dichotomy. In fact, these ideas are not mutually exclusive at all. Indeed, today we have a number of programs, ideas, and warnings all vying for consideration in K-12 curricula across the country. Thus, there are sometimes dramatic differences in the way in which students are educated. With regards to citizenship, some students are taught to be good people, while others are taught for social justice, and still others are taught next to nothing about their role in civil society, and teachers focus completely on the economic outcomes of education for either the individual or the collective. And here we see varying authors, from Thomas Friedman and The World is Flat, to Tony Wagner and the Global Achievement Gap, to Action Civics curricula, and still further to educational collaboratives, all mixing these different conceptions. But throughout history, we can see a cycle and some historical trends that bring us from the individual in society to the collective in society, to the collective economically, to the collective, or to the individual economically.